Welcome to CrashRacer. Today we're playing Wreckfest, and this video is all about the tuning settings in the game, what each of the settings are and how you can best use them to your advantage when you're racing or attempting to complete the challenges. So each tuning option has 5 settings, and usually the default is the middle one, or setting 3. But by changing these settings I'll show you what effect that has on the car and what are generally best for certain track types. Starting with the suspension setting at the top then, and the first thing to note is when you stiffen the suspension, the chassis of the car is lower to the ground, and when you soften the suspension, the chassis of the car is raised up. So irrelevant of any of the differences that changing the suspension makes, you need to make sure that the bottom of the car isn't going to catch the ground on rough dirt tracks or on circuits with lots of bumps and jumps. The main point of changing the suspension is to allow the car to handle uneven track surfaces better. If we use this mud digger and fully stiffen the suspension and then drive it over these jumps at the Dirt Devil Stadium, due to the high ride height of the mud digger, there's no issue with the bottom of the vehicle hitting the ground, but it's a very rough ride and the wheels are off the ground a lot, which makes it hard to keep the speed up. Now if we fully soften the suspension and go again, we can see the impacts are now a lot more cushioned and the tyres stay in contact with the track more. Now one other thing to consider is the more you soften the suspension, the more body roll the car will have, and we can best demonstrate this using the most top heavy car in the game, the double decker. We'll start with the suspension set to maximum stiffness. Now as we race around this track and steer right, we can see the car leaning to the left, and then when we turn left around this corner, the centre of gravity shifts and the car starts leaning to the right. Of course on cars that are a lot closer to the ground and less top heavy than the double decker, you don't see this quite as much. Okay, let's change the suspension then and soften it fully and go again, and now as you can see, as we turn around this corner here, it's really leaning over, and as we come to this corner, over it goes. It's so easy to topple the car over in that way. So that's the suspension setting, and the general rules would probably be stiffen it slightly for flat race tracks as long as the car doesn't bottom out, and soften it slightly for tracks with lots of bumps and jumps, but be careful not to soften it too much or it can then be easy to topple the car over. On to the next setting then, which is gear ratio, and as the information on the right shows, the general rule is to have it as short as you can but where you never run out of gearing. Perhaps the only exceptions to this rule are where you want to change the gear ratio when you're using manual gears if it makes the gear changes easier, or possibly if a good start and acceleration out of some corners is so important that it outweighs losing a little bit of top speed. So by lengthening the gear ratio you can see the top speed increases but the acceleration will decrease. Let's try this out first with a very short gear ratio on a long straight section of track. Acceleration from the start then is very fast. We're up through the gears and into 6th very quickly, but now our top speed is maxed out at just over 170 km per hour. Now let's set the gear ratio to the maximum and go again. Slightly slow away from the start this time, and bigger gaps between the gear changes. We're now way over 170 km per hour and still only in 4th gear, so lots of speed still to be had if this was an even longer straight. The next setting is the differential. The default position is limited, and you can either move it more open, which will improve the stability and handling of the car around corners, or more locked, where the handling is not as good but it gives better grip through the corners and better acceleration out of them. So with an open differential around a track like the Eagles Peak Motor Park, where there's a loose surface, the car feels really stable through the corners, whereas with a locked differential it's slightly more difficult to control, but you can get the power down and accelerate out of the corner a lot quicker. The differential setting is probably the one I tinker with the least, and I'll normally either leave it at position 3 or for tracks where there's loose surfaces just change it to position 4. The final tuning setting then is the brake balance, and this one has a big effect, not only when braking in a straight line but even more so when braking for corners. By moving the brake balance to the front, you'll see the cornering value go down. When you're racing and braking into corners, the car is really stable, but there's so much understeer it's difficult to get the car turned in. We'll do a brake test at the finish line, and as you can see we didn't quite stop before the barriers. Now if we change the brake balance to the rear, the car itself isn't quite as stable, but it turns into the corners so much better. And another brake test, and this time we stop before getting to the barriers. So I personally never move the brake balance to the front. I prefer, if I'm going to move it, then I'll move it to the rear, either to position 2 or even 1. The only thing you have to watch is that it can cause the car to oversteer, in which case then I'd move it back 1 position. So that's the end of my Wreckfest tuning settings video. I hope you found it useful. If you liked it, please like it and subscribe, and see you soon.